Imagine a shadowy hall, lit only by the weak fire of a hearth that never quite warms. The castle's stone walls seem to hold ancient murmurs, as if each block has witnessed something that never made it into books. Outside, rain falls heavily on the courtyard, dragging mud and reminding us that in the feudal world nothing was clean, not the land, not the laws, not the stories that survived. Inside the hall, the feudal lord rests in his high chair, but his silent absence reveals more than his presence ever could. He was the law, the punishment, and also the secret. In the surrounding villages, people spoke of the daughters the Lord left scattered throughout the region, fruits of forced encounters, of favors demanded, of silent pacts sealed under fear. These children grew up carrying a stigma they did not choose. Some were hidden, others given to the castle as servants, and there were those who, by birth, carried the mark of a destiny decided before they even opened their eyes. The corridor leading to the Lord's private chambers was narrow, almost suffocating. Many avoided passing through there, not out of superstition, but out of memory. Memory of what happened when a servant became pregnant. Memory of what was reserved for children who could not inherit the name, but carried the blood. Memory of what it meant to be born a bastard in a world where power and brutality were the same thing. What you are about to hear did not survive in the respectable annals of history. It survived in the fear of the villages, in the whispers of the kitchens, in the silent pain of women who were never mentioned. And it is in this silence that the truth lies. To understand the weight of these stories, it is necessary to recognize something that spans generations. The pain of those who never had a choice. Many who watch this video know this type of wound, the wound of carrying a name they did not ask for, a silence they do not understand, a weight that should not be theirs. It is not necessary to have lived in the Middle Ages to feel the impact of inherited injustices, of imposed responsibilities, of destinies that were decided by others. The bastard daughters of feudal lords lived in this invisible territory between belonging and rejection. They were not recognized by their father, but they were also not completely accepted by the villagers. They were reminded of their own origin by looks, gestures, and whispers. They grew up in a shadow they did not create, but that determined everything: where they could step, who they could talk to, who they could be. This same experience resonates today in people who have faced abandonment, family rejection, or inequality from an early age. The pain of these young women was silent because no one taught them that they had the right to a voice. The mother suffered the shame, the daughter suffered the fate, and the feudal lord continued living as if that were part of the natural order of the world. This is where history and psychology meet. When we realize that systems built on fear and submission produce traumas that spread for decades, sometimes for centuries. Human suffering, when ignored, turns into inheritance, and the bastard daughters carried this inheritance not only in their blood, but in their souls, shaped by a world that saw them as a consequence, not as people. In the feudal system, the lord of the castle concentrated in himself all possible powers: political, military, economic, and moral. He was judge, legislator, and often predator. What he desired became custom. What he practiced became tradition. In poor villages, where no one had the resources to challenge authority, abuses were masked as seigneurial right, as part of the established order. This is how many of the children considered bastards were born, fruits of imposed encounters, of relationships crossed by fear or the need for survival. When these girls grew up, they became silent pieces within the feudal structure. Those who were taken to the castle carried the mark of a bond they could not declare. Those who remained in the village became living reminders of the Lord's supremacy, reminders that caused discomfort both in the wives and in the servants. They lived in a no-man's land. They had no right to the paternal name, but they could not escape his influence either. The psychology of power at that time functioned like an invisible current. The feudal lord was surrounded by advisors who reinforced his authority, by the church that legitimized his dominion, and by a society that naturalized inequality. Many lords grew up believing that everything belonged to them: lands, harvests, bodies, destinies. The bastard, for them, was not the fruit of guilt, but of dominion, a living proof that power could cross intimate borders without being punished. Behind these behaviors there was insecurity, paranoia, and an incessant desire to leave a legacy, even if fragmented, hidden, and unrecognized. This is how, in secret, many shaped the destiny of their daughters in an era where birth determined everything except humanity. The story almost always began at dawn, when the fog still clung to the hills and the castle seemed to float over the valley. A maid walked hurriedly across the courtyard, holding a bundle where a newborn child rested, too small, too silent. The guards looked away. They knew exactly what that scene meant. It was not the first time. It would not be the last. The side door of the castle opened with a discreet creak, revealing a narrow corridor used only for matters that should not attract attention. There the light was dim, and the air carried a smell of damp wood mixed with the cheap perfume of herbs that tried to disguise the undesirable. The maid handed the child to another woman, a wet nurse chosen carefully, someone who knew how to keep silent better than any oath. Meanwhile, upstairs, the wife of the feudal lord walked in circles. She already knew the ritual. With each new birth that was not hers, she felt the weight of a betrayal that no one dared to name. The castle was large, but the silence inside it was greater, and in the surrounding villages, mothers tried to hide their bastard daughters to prevent them from being summoned to the castle when they grew up, a fate that some feared more than hunger itself. When the child became young, the divided path was always the same: silent servitude within the walls, where her origins were mentioned only in whispers, or veiled abandonment in the village, where her presence reminded of the power of the one who would never be her father. On one of those mornings, a young bastard walked for the first time to the main hall, holding a tray. The feudal lord observed her with a cold, evaluating gaze. She realized at that moment that her entire life had been written long before she learned to walk. That was how destiny began. The castle operated like a perfect gear, silent, slow, and cruel. The bastard daughters growing up within its walls were shaped by a system that did not need to raise a hand to destroy identities. The method was psychological, refined, almost invisible. First, they were deprived of recognition. They did not have a full name. They were not mentioned in ceremonies. They were not allowed to sit at the main table. This created, from an early age, the perception that they existed only halfway: useful presence, incomplete person. Then came the isolation. The young women were allocated to distant chambers, away from the common servants, and too far from the nobility. Wherever they looked, there were doors they could not cross, conversations they could not hear, decisions they would never be part of. None of this was said out loud. It was suggested through averted glances, short orders, calculated silences. Little by little, they learned that their limits were unquestionable. Finally came the function: to be seen, evaluated, used as convenient pieces for internal alliances. Some were given as wives to petty officers to reinforce loyalties. Others were kept in the castle, where they served as silent reminders of the Lord's power. The cruelest of practices was uncertainty, never knowing whether they would be protected as blood of the castle, or discarded as a consequence of a sin they did not commit. This was the true feudal machine: not the sword, not the steel, but the ability to control entire lives through imposed destiny, denied identity, and mandatory silence. The bastard daughters were living proof that in the Middle Ages, the most efficient cruelty was the one that no one needed to confess. The breaking point arose unexpectedly, not in a scream, nor in an act of rebellion, but in an intimate, devastating instant, when the young bastard understood that her life would never be hers. On one of those gray afternoons, while the wind blew through the narrow windows of the castle, one of the girls was called to the great hall. She was about 15 years old and had spent her entire life obeying without asking. She walked with hesitant steps, trying to hide the tremor in her hands. When she entered, the feudal lord was sitting in his high chair, observing her with the usual coldness. Beside him, two advisors murmured to each other. The silence weighed so much that it seemed like a third character in the room. The young woman realized that something was about to be decided, not about the castle, but about her. The Lord rose slowly and walked towards her. He did not need to say cruel words, the lack of them was already enough. With a simple gesture, he pointed to an older man, an officer of low nobility. It was at that moment that the young woman understood. Her destiny had been negotiated. She would be sent to marry someone she had never met, just to strengthen ties that she was not to blame for existing. Her breath caught. Her eyes did not seek her father's. There was nothing there. No recognition, no remorse, just power doing what it always did, shaping lives as if they were tools. It was there that something broke inside, the cruel feeling of being less a person and more a coin. She did not cry. She couldn't. But in that silent instant, she felt the last part of her childhood being torn away, and for the first time, she realized the extent of the punishment of carrying a blood that could not be named. That was the true feudal ritual, transforming a human life into a consequence. When the destiny of a bastard was sealed, the castle continued to function as if nothing had happened. The torches were lit at dusk, the guards made their rounds, the servants carried water and firewood. But for those who knew the corridors from the inside, something changed silently. The young woman who left behind a strange emptiness, not because someone considered her indispensable, but because her absence reminded everyone that, inside there, each life could be exchanged as a piece of a game that no one admitted to playing. Some of these young women, sent to arranged marriages, disappeared from the castle's memory. Others returned years later, no longer as silent servants, but as women marked by the emotional wear and tear of having been used as a political tool. Those who remained within the walls, living under constant surveillance, became shadows of themselves, obedient, cautious, disconnected from any idea of belonging. Their existence was a living scar of the feudal structure. Over the generations, the presence of these illegitimate daughters shaped behaviors, from the nobility to the plebs. The lords' wives became more rigid and distrustful, the village mothers more fearful, and the servants more attentive to the limits of seigneurial power. The church, although silent, knew that each bastard was a moral flaw hidden under the mantle of the sacred, and the entire court, even if it never commented out loud, was kept cohesive by this diffuse fear, the fear of becoming the next sacrificed piece. Historians rarely mention these lives, but their echoes still breathe in oral stories, in local legends, and in the deep distrust that has spanned centuries. Because feudalism ended, but the mark of living at the mercy of absolute power remains alive whenever someone remembers those who were born of abuse and carried that destiny alone. In the end, when we revisit the practices of the feudal lords and the silent destiny of their bastard daughters, we realize that the castle was never just a stone construction. It was, and continues to be, a symbol of what absolute power can do when no one is watching. Behind the luxurious tapestries and illuminated halls hid stories of lives shaped by fear, by the absence of choice, and by a silence that spanned generations like a whisper that never fades. These young women did not leave letters, did not have a voice in the official records, and in many cases did not even receive names worthy of memory, but they carried in their bodies and souls the weight of a system that saw in them more utility than humanity. Their destinies were not shaped by their own mistakes, but by decisions made in dark rooms, by men who confused authority with right and power with possession. And yet, these erased lives shaped society in ways that historians rarely admit. They were the ones who revealed the cracks in the system, the abuses that sustained the order, and the fragility of the authority that claimed to be absolute. There remains, then, one last question, one that does not seek an immediate answer, but deep reflection. How many stories still remain buried under the power structures that we insist on calling tradition? Feudalism is over, but the echo of these lives still breathes in human distrust, in inherited fear, and in the memory of those who know that injustice has many forms, and not all of them leave visible marks.